Welcome to Module 1, Lesson 2, Adding Integers with Different Signs. So the main difference between this lesson and the last one is the fact that we are now looking at different signs. After this lesson, we'll be able to add rational numbers with different signs, represent addition of rational numbers with different signs on a number line, apply properties of operations to add rational numbers with different signs. So in that case, when we're applying properties, we are talking kind of about the commutative property, but also the idea that when you add, so the same sign, we know that you just add the absolute value, keep the sign. And then today we're going to talk about what you do when they're different. So that's what that applying properties means. And then solve real world and mathematical problems involving addition with rational numbers with different signs. So the essential question, how do you add integers with different signs? That should be the absolute top thing that you can do when you are done with this lesson. So when we're adding on a number line, we talked about this a little bit in the last lesson. The addition sign and the negative sign and the subtraction sign tell you which way you're going. So in this case, if we look at the sum of 3 plus 2, we can start at 3 and then move 2 units in a positive direction because the 2 is positive. So here we have 3 and then we're moving to the right because that's what the plus sign tells us to do. And since this is positive, we continue to go to the right. So we start at 3 and move 2 units to the right. Again, we always look at that absolute value. So no matter if this number is positive or negative, that number is going to tell us how many spaces we need to move. And then the negative or lack of a negative sign tells us which direction we have to move. All right, but now let's look at 3 plus a negative 2. So again, we're still going to move 2 units, but in this case, so the plus sign tells us to move right, but then the negative sign says, nope, undo that, you're actually going to go to the left. So in this case, we start at 3 again because that's where it tells us to, and we go 2 spaces to the left. 1, 2. So in this case, we got an answer of 5 when we added the 2 positives, but here, when we had a positive and a negative, we ended up with an answer of 1. If you can remember when you're on a number line that the addition, subtraction, and negative signs, they tell you which way to go. And really, once you get used to this idea of which way on the number line you're going, the addition and subtraction of integers gets a lot easier. All right, so again, we're going to model this on a number line. So here we have 4 plus a negative 3. That first number is always where we start. So I'm going to get a nice big dot here on 4. Let me make this a little bigger. Oh, that's too big. All right, so we're putting our dot on 4. And then now this plus sign tells us that we should move to the right. But then we have the negative sign that undoes that and says actually move to the left. So we're going to move left 3 spaces because we take that absolute value of negative 3 and get 3, and that tells us how many spaces we move. So 1, 2, 3. So in this case, 4 plus a negative 3 gives me a positive 1. Same idea here. So I start this time at negative 7. And I'm adding, so I'm going to the right, a positive 5. So there's no negative to undo it. So I start at negative 7, and I'm going to move 5 units to the right. So 1, and I apologize, I ran out of space, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in this case, we got to negative 2. Okay, and I forgot this part down here, or in the opposite direction. Okay, so now we have a positive 6. So again, we're going to start at 6. And we're going to move, so we take the absolute value of negative 6, and we get 6. And this tells us how much to move. And then the sign tells us which way. So addition said right, but then the negative took it to the opposite and said we're actually moving to the left. So move 6 units to the left. Or in this case, because we're in positive, we're moving to the opposite direction. If this were a positive number, we'd be moving in the same direction. So here, if I start at positive 6, and I'm moving 6 units to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 6 plus a negative 6 got me 0. So I want you to take a look at this and kind of keep in mind what's happening to your integers or to your answers when you're adding a positive and a negative, and kind of pay attention to what happens when that negative number is further away from 0. We're going to talk about that a little bit more coming up. So make a prediction. Predict the sum of negative 2 plus 2 and explain your prediction and check it using the number line. So I want you to make a prediction of what your answer is going to be, and then justify your prediction, and then come back and take a look. All right, so here we have a negative 2, so we start at the negative, and then the plus tells us to go to the right, and the 2 tells us to go 2 units, so I go 1, 2 units, and I get to 0. Right? So whatever your prediction was in your justification, it should be somewhere along the lines of the fact that if I'm 2 spaces away from 0 to the left, and I'm told that I'm going to move 2 spaces to the right, if these two numbers are the same and in opposite directions, they should get us to 0. And we remember that from talking about opposites in 6th grade. All right, so now we're going to pull the counters into play here. So that was using the number line, which you have to be able to plot them on a number line. Now we're going to take a look at what happens when we use counters. So if I'm modeling 3 plus a negative 2, remember my yellows are my positives and my negatives are, or my reds are my negatives. And each red and yellow cancel each other out. So in this case, I'm starting with positive 3 and negative 2. And these two cancel each other out. So what's left when I remove the pairs? 1 positive counter. So the sum plus 3 and negative 2 is 1. So now let's look at that when we're talking about negative 6 plus a positive 3. So I'm going to use different colored pencils here, and I would suggest that you do the same. So I have negative 6, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then plus a positive 3, 1, 2, 3. So now I have to go through, so I start with 6 counters to represent, so 6 red counters to represent negative 6, and I add 3 yellow counters to represent adding a positive 3. So when I look at the pairs, these two cancel each other out, these two cancel each other out, and these two cancel each other out. And I'm left with 3 positive counters. So the sum, 3 negative counters. So the sum of negative 6 plus a positive 3 is negative 3. When we're talking about addition and subtract, or addition with positive and negative integers, if you've noticed, the further away you are from 0, the longer it takes you to get back to 0. So here, since negative 6 is further away from 0, and 3 is obviously closer to 0, I don't have enough to get me back to 0. So in order to get me back to 0, I would need 6 positive counters. I only have 3, so that also tells me that my answer should be negative, since the negative 6 is further away from 0. The other way to look at it, the absolute value of negative 6 is 6, and the absolute value of positive 3 is 3. Since this has the larger absolute value, it's further from 0, so this 3 isn't going to get me out of the red. I'm going to be stuck with these red negatives, so my answer would have to be negative. So Kyle models a sum of 2 integers. He uses more negative counters than positive counters. What do you predict about the sign of the sum? Explain. Take a minute, make a prediction, and then come back and check your answer. Okay, so my prediction would have been that the sum of the two numbers would be negative because I don't have enough positive chips to undo the negative chips. Or I don't have enough positive values, or I do not have enough of a positive value to get out of the negative values. So again, if you look at a number line, you make a real quick one here. All right, if I'm at 0 and this was -6, if I'm at -6, in order to get back to 0, I have to go 6 places. If I can only go 3, so -6 plus 3, that only allows me to hop 3 spots, 2, 3. So that only gets me to -3. I still have all this that I didn't get out of. That's what I mean by not being able to undo those negative values. All right, so you should have gone through and seen that we talked about additive inverse. So additive inverse, again, numbers that add to 0. And basically, the things that you've learned so far, when you add integers that have the same sign, you add the absolute values and then keep the sign. Different signs. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to actually use the absolute value and you're going to subtract. So you're going to subtract the lesser absolute value from the greater absolute value and then use the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value for the sum. So in this case, let's look at these examples. I have 3 and -5. The absolute value of 3 is 3 and the absolute value of -5 is 5. Since this one is bigger, my answer has to be negative because the 5 is negative. So then what I do is I take my absolute values and I subtract and I get 2. And so my answer has to be negative, so my answer is a -2. Again, if you look at a number line and you're at -5, and you're at 3, and I have to go back 5. 1, 2, 3. Well, that gets me back to 0. Now I have to go 2 more. 1, 2. That puts me at -2. All right, so again, you have an example here of finding the sum. You can read this. We're going to jump to the next ones where we try it on our own. So here, use it modeling on the number line. I would like you to try 1 through 4 and then come back and check your answers. So here I plotted at 9. This tells me to go right, but that actually tells me to go opposite and go left. 3 spaces, 1, 2, 3. So the answer is 6. And I know that because 9 has the larger absolute value. Here I start at a -2, and I'm adding 7, so I'm still going to the right. So I go to the right 7 spaces, 2, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I get to a +5. Again, notice 7 has a larger absolute value than -2, and my answer ended up being positive. So -15 is right here, +4, that tells me that I'm going to the right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, that gives me a -11. If I plot 1, this tells me to go to the right, but then the negative tells me to go to the left. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So I get a -3. Using the counters, go ahead and try 5 through 8 and then come back and check your answers. So here, these all cancel each other out and I'm left with a +1. These two cancel each other out. I'm left with a -3. These all cancel each other out, so I'm left with 0. So -6 and 6 are additive inverses. And these cancel each other out, so I'm left with 4. Now let's actually try to use that absolute value plan. So here I'm going to do, so the absolute value of 14 is 14, and the absolute value of negative 8 is 8. So I actually do 14 minus 8, which gives me 6. And since the positive number has the larger absolute value, my answer has to be positive. So what I want you to do, I want you to go through and check and see if your answer is going to be positive or negative. And before you add or subtract, come back and check. So here, my answer should be positive because 7 has the greater absolute value. Here, my answer is negative 12. They are actually going to cancel each other out. Here, my answer is going to be negative, and here my answer is going to be positive. Now go back and use subtraction and get your answer. So again, absolute values minus each other. Here's 2, so I get positive 2, because I said my answer would be positive. Here, the absolute value of 21, or of negative 21, is 21. The absolute value of 5 is 5. Subtract those, I get 16. But since negative 21 is bigger or has the larger absolute value, my answer is negative. Here it's 14 and negative 14, so my answer is 0. Here I have 5, so negative 5, the absolute value is 5. And 0, the absolute value is 0. I subtract these and I get 5. But my answer is negative because 5 has the larger absolute value. Here, the absolute value of 32 equals 32. And the absolute value of negative 8 is 8. When I subtract those, I get, oh my goodness, I can't write here, 26. And my answer is going to be positive. So here, what I would like you to do, you have a couple of your turn problems that you need to try. You also need to answer the essential question. So go back into these parts in your notes and answer those questions. As always, if you have any questions, please be sure to email me or write them down so we can go over them in class.